Many non-Catholics who study the early Church believe that the case of Pope Vigilius and the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 refutes Catholic teaching on papal supremacy and papal infallibility.
Basically, because you have, to put this kind of bluntly, you have an ecumenical council saying we have authority over and apart from the Roman bishop, okay?
Many of them think that the incident involving Vigilius is the strongest argument against the papacy.
And Pope Vigilius did not condemn these 3 chapters of the books, and because of that, Pope Vigilius was excommunicated. The Fifth Ecumenical Council refutes Vatican I and the whole Roman Catholic system.
This video will cover many important points, and it will show why their objections completely fail. It will also demonstrate that non-Catholics such as the Eastern Orthodox and various Protestants often grossly misrepresent the facts about Pope Vigilius and Constantinople II, the Fifth Ecumenical Council. In the process, they deceive people. The case of Pope Vigilius and Constantinople II does not refute papal supremacy or papal infallibility. This subject is somewhat involved and complicated. However, we will try to cover the key points as concisely as possible. Getting into various details is unavoidable, however. I've read all the acts of the Second Council of Constantinople. The controversy centers around what are called the 3 chapters, which were 1. The person and writings of Theodore of Mopsuestia, 2. Certain writings of Theodoret of Cyrus, and 3. A letter to Mari the Persian, which was often attributed to Ibas of Edessa. Those writings contain certain elements of the Nestorian heresy. Now, the Eastern Roman emperor during this period of the 6th century was Justinian I. Justinian had a deep interest in theology, and he wanted to bring the Miaphysites, who are sometimes called Monophysites, who denied the Council of Chalcedon, back into union with the Church. The Oriental Orthodox are modern-day Miaphysites. After the Council of Chalcedon, the Miaphysites had falsely accused the Church of Nestorianism. They attempted to substantiate their accusation by pointing out that the 3 chapters, which contained elements of Nestorianism, had not been condemned. Consequently, Emperor Justinian tried to secure the condemnation of the 3 chapters in the hope of convincing the Miaphysites to join the Church. The dilemma, however, was that during Session 8 of the Council of Chalcedon in 451, Theodoret of Cyrus, whose writings contained some errors and support for Nestorianism, was restored to his see after he manifested agreement with the council and agreed to anathematize Nestorius. Further, during Session 10 of Chalcedon, the case of Ibas of Edessa was examined. Ibas gave a profession of faith, and his profession of faith was considered sound. Therefore, the Council of Chalcedon judged Ibas worthy of being restored to his see. Since the Council of Chalcedon had restored 2 of the individuals involved in the 3 chapters controversy following their professions of faith, a full-scale condemnation of the 3 chapters might be perceived by some as an attack on the authority of Chalcedon. Further, the Church had already condemned Nestorianism at the Council of Ephesus. Thus, many did not consider a condemnation of the 3 chapters to be necessary or wise, since it might be considered an attack on Chalcedon and on 2 individuals who were believed to have died in communion with the Church. Nevertheless, the Emperor Justinian, who had the political power, was determined to see the 3 chapters condemned, and he exerted his authority to get it done. In 544 to 545, Justinian issued an edict in which the 3 chapters were condemned. The text of this edict does not survive, but its contents are clear from references in other texts, such as in Facundus's defense of the 3 chapters. Justinian moved to get the bishops to subscribe to his edict of 544 to 545, in which the 3 chapters were condemned. The Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, named Minas, hesitated. Here's a description of what happened according to theologian Father Alfonso Muzzarelli, who died in 1813. Quote, "The Patriarchs of the East signed, but Minas of Constantinople added the condition that if these things were not approved by the Roman bishop, his own autograph would be returned to him, which was promised to him under the guarantee of an oath. And so Justinian, feeling that nothing in this business respecting the status of the churches could usefully be attempted without the decision of the Roman pontiff, summons Vigilius from Rome." End quote. As we can see, when he was initially pressured to sign the emperor's edict of 544 to 545, Minas, the Patriarch of Constantinople, signed, but he added the condition that if these things were not approved by the Pope, his own signature would be returned to him or withdrawn. This fact, which is cited by Muzzarelli and others, comes from Facundus, a 6th century author and bishop who was in Constantinople when Justinian's edict was issued. So at the very outset of this controversy, we find further evidence for papal supremacy in the Patriarch of Constantinople's submission to the authority and judgment of the Roman pontiff. The Patriarch of Constantinople's initial deference to the authority of the Pope in this matter is similar to how Anatolius, the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time of the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century, acknowledged that the whole force and confirmation of the Acts of Chalcedon was reserved to Pope St. Leo the Great. In April of 454, after the Council of Chalcedon, Anatolius of Constantinople wrote to the Pope, quote, "Even so the whole force and confirmation of the Acts of Chalcedon was reserved for the authority of your blessedness." End quote. Eventually, Patriarch Minos and other Eastern bishops submitted to the will of Justinian and went along with his edict. However, Justinian recognized that the Bishop of Rome was the most important bishop in the church. In order to secure his agreement, in 545, Justinian summoned Vigilius from Rome. It's also noteworthy that in the Code of Emperor Justinian's officially promulgated body of civil law, which was enacted from 529 to 534, there is included an exchange of letters between Pope John II, who became pope in 533, and Emperor Justinian. Pope John II's letter to the emperor, which is included in Justinian's Code of Law, states, quote, "You have preserved reverence for the See of Rome and have subjected all things to its authority." It also states, "This see is indeed the head of all churches, as the rules of the fathers and the decrees of emperors assert, and the words of your most reverend piety testify." End quote. This is in Justinian's Code of Law. Justinian's code then includes the response from the emperor, quote, "We hasten to bring to the knowledge of your holiness everything relating to the condition of the church. Therefore we have exerted ourselves to unite all the priests of the East and subject them to the see of your holiness." He then says, "For we do not suffer anything which has reference to the state of the church, even though what causes the difficulty may be clear and free from doubt, to be discussed without being brought to the notice of your holiness, because you are the head of all the holy churches." End quote. Justinian then refers to the Patriarch of Constantinople and says that he is, quote, "eager in all things to follow the apostolic see of your blessedness." End quote. As we can see, Emperor Justinian's words in his official code of law recognized the Pope as the supreme head of the Christian Church, to whom those in the East should be subject. Following being summoned by Justinian, Vigilius arrived in Constantinople in January of 547. Since Vigilius rejected Nestorianism and saw value in condemning Nestorian elements of the three chapters, he issued his Judicatum in 548, in which the three chapters were condemned. However, he added a clause that essentially stated, quote, "while preserving respect for the Synod of Chalcedon." End quote. Pope Vigilius wanted to ensure that nothing in the 548 Judicatum would detract from the authority of the Council of Chalcedon. Nevertheless, his Judicatum was still perceived by various Western bishops as a retreat from Chalcedon. Consequently, it was rejected by many, and some even severed communion with him over it. This brings us to two important considerations about papal supremacy. Some critics of the papacy make the false argument that if it can be shown that decisions of popes were ever resisted or rejected, or that popes themselves were rejected, that's incompatible with Catholic claims on papal supremacy. No, it's not. First, many ecumenical councils and core truths about Jesus Christ were resisted by bishops in church history. Consider the widespread resistance to Nicaea and Chalcedon for many decades after those councils. Does that mean that those councils or the truths they taught weren't binding or were uncertain, or that the truths weren't part of the deposit of faith? No, it simply means that as a result of pride, rebellion, and bad will, men often reject the truth. Second, the people in the early church generally understood the Galatians 1:8 principle, which is that if anyone clearly departs from the apostolic faith, even if he purports to be a heavenly messenger or the supreme authority in the church, he is to be rejected and considered automatically outside the church. Another way to put it is that a manifest heretic automatically ceases to be a member of the church, and Catholics are not to hold communion with him, no matter what position he purports to hold. An acknowledgement of the Galatians 1:8 principle, that is, of automatic exclusion from the church for manifest heresy, is not incompatible with firm belief that a valid bishop of Rome has supreme jurisdiction over the entire church and is infallible under certain conditions. We see this in the first millennium with Eastern Father St. Maximus the Confessor. He taught that the Pope had jurisdiction over the entire church and that the See of Rome was indefectible. For example, he stated, quote, "If he wants to not be considered a heretic, let him hasten above all to satisfy the Roman See, the most blessed Pope of the Holy Church of the Romans, that is, of the Apostolic See, which in all things and through all things commands and has authority and power of binding and loosing over the holy churches of God all over the world, given by the word of God made man, as well as by all holy synods according to the sacred canons." End quote. Yet St. Maximus also said that he would reject anyone, even an angel, who clearly departed from the apostolic faith. Belief in the papacy is not incompatible with an acceptance of the Galatians 1:8 principle. That's why even various Western bishops rejected Vigilius when they thought he had lapsed into heresy. Keep this in mind when considering what happened to Vigilius at Constantinople too. Indeed, St. Robert Bellarmine, a doctor of the Catholic Church who believed in papal primacy and infallibility, also taught that a manifest heretic would automatically cease to be the pope. This principle was recognized in the early church and during the time of Vigilius. But as we will see, it wasn't always properly applied. The fact that the Galatians 1:8 principle was sometimes incorrectly or hastily applied does not invalidate the principle itself or the papal claims. The papal claims are proven from sacred scripture and from councils that even the Eastern Orthodox claim to accept. See, for instance, our video on Nicaea II. Since there was so much resistance to his 548 Judicatum, Vigilius withdrew it. Instead, Vigilius and Justinian agreed to resolve the controversy over the 3 chapters at an ecumenical council. However, Justinian broke the agreement, and in 551 he issued a personal edict called On the Orthodox Faith, in which he condemned the 3 chapters. Obviously feeling pressure from the emperor, Patriarch Minos of Constantinople and others subscribed to this 551 edict of Justinian. Not surprisingly, Pope Vigilius was dismayed that Justinian had breached their agreement and violated Vigilius's ecclesiastical prerogative. He responded by excommunicating Patriarch Minos and threatening with excommunication others who subscribed to the emperor's new edict. Emperor Justinian responded by imprisoning and mistreating Pope Vigilius. Justinian used physical force at various points in this controversy. In fact, on February 5, 552, Pope Vigilius wrote an encyclical letter called Dum in Sancte Euphemiae. In this encyclical, Pope Vigilius identifies himself as occupant of St. Peter's See with authority over the Church, citing biblical passages about the authority given to St. Peter. He also describes how he was assaulted and mistreated by Emperor Justinian's men. Quote, "We trust that no one is unaware that in this very church the suite of the praetor came with a mass of armed soldiers in serried array, as if for war, and tried to drag us by our feet from its sacred altar." End quote. They tried to drag Vigilius from the altar by his feet. Vigilius and others were very much under pressure to submit to Justinian's view. However, after this embarrassing assault on Pope Vigilius and the Church, Emperor Justinian temporarily backed down. He withdrew his 551 edict, and on June 26, 552, he received Vigilius at court. Quote, "It has been said that from the conflict of emperor and pope, Vigilius emerged the victor." End quote. During this period, Patriarch Minos of Constantinople and other Eastern bishops who had been excommunicated by Vigilius asked for forgiveness from the Pope. They also made a profession of faith in the Church of St. Euphemia between mid-February and mid-June 552. Vigilius quoted it in his first constitutum. It stated, quote, "In the case of the 3 chapters where an inquiry has been initiated, I have composed no document contrary to the decision of the most pious prince and your beatitude, but I desire and concur that all documents of this form should be submitted to your beatitude." End quote. Here Minos, the Patriarch of Constantinople in 552, states that all the documents of this controversy should be submitted to Pope Vigilius and acknowledgement of the Pope's primacy of authority. He also begged forgiveness for whatever injuries were done to Vigilius and his see. In light of this fact, that Minos and others specifically apologized to Pope Vigilius on this matter, consider the following claim made by an Eastern Orthodox heretic. He's referring to Vigilius in this clip.
And at no point do the patriarchs apologize to him for asserting their authority over him. At no point does he say they were wrong to do it.
As we've shown, his claim is false, like so many other things the Eastern Orthodox say about these matters. Minos even asks forgiveness for receiving into communion people who had been excommunicated by Pope Vigilius. Quote, "Because at a time of discord I received into communion persons who had been excommunicated or not received by your beatitude, I likewise beg forgiveness." End quote. This is more evidence that Minos recognized the Pope's primacy of authority. He and the other bishops also state, quote, "We shall follow and observe in all respects the letters of Pope Leo of blessed memory, and the decrees of the Apostolic See that dealt with the faith and the validity of the above-mentioned 4 synods." End quote. Arrangements were then made to hold a council. The emperor wanted Pope Vigilius to attend, but he would not. The council opened without him on May 5, 553. It was very much under the sway of the emperor, yet we find more evidence for papal primacy in Session 1. During Session 1, a letter and profession of faith from Patriarch Eutychius of Constantinople, who had succeeded Minos, was read out. It was written to Pope Vigilius on behalf of the bishops. It states, quote, "We also receive and embrace the letters of the bishops of the Apostolic Roman See, those of others as well as of Leo of holy memory, written concerning the faith and the 4 holy synods or one of them." End quote. The people at Session 1 profess that they receive and embrace the letters of the popes, including Pope St. Leo the Great, written concerning the faith. This is similar to the June 6, 552 profession of Minos and others that we previously cited. This proves the Catholic position on the papacy because it's easily demonstrated that Pope St. Leo the Great and others taught that they had supreme jurisdiction from Christ over the universal church as successors of St. Peter. That means that the papal primacy of jurisdiction over the universal church was endorsed at Session 1 of Constantinople II by the endorsement of the official teaching of the Roman pontiffs on the faith. The same is proven from other councils. See our video on Nicaea II. That contradicts the Eastern Orthodox position and proves the Catholic position. In the same document, Eutychius requests that Pope Vigilius come and preside at the council. Despite this acceptance of the teaching of the Roman pontiffs on the faith, the council was determined to achieve Justinian's desired outcome of a full condemnation of the 3 chapters. It continued to call for Pope Vigilius to participate, but he would not. Vigilius felt that his ecclesiastical authority was being undermined by Emperor Justinian. Instead of attending the council, Vigilius published his first constitutum on May 14, 553. This document gave a partial, not a full, condemnation of the 3 chapters. We will refute the claims that this document violates papal infallibility. Since Pope Vigilius's first constitutum failed to carry out the wishes of Justinian of a full condemnation of the 3 chapters, Vigilius was now considered to be a heretic by Justinian and the council. At Session 7, the people at Constantinople II broke communion with Vigilius by removing him from the diptychs and declaring him to be alien to the Catholic Church. Yet they declared that they were not breaking communion with the Roman See. So does this prove that the decrees of an ecumenical council asserted its authority over the reigning pope, and does it refute Catholic teaching on papal supremacy? The answer is no. First, the decrees of Constantinople II were not decrees of an ecumenical council until Pope Vigilius approved them. Let me repeat that. They were not decrees of an ecumenical council until Pope Vigilius approved them. By the time that Pope Vigilius approved the decrees of the council, the statements that condemned him were removed from the final version of the Acts, as we will see. The teaching of the Second Council of Nicaea, a council that the Eastern Orthodox claim to accept, proves that the decrees of Constantinople II were not decrees of an ecumenical council until the Pope approved them. We covered this important passage in our video on Nicaea II. Note that this passage is often misrepresented by supporters of Eastern Orthodoxy. Nicaea II stated, quote, "And how can a council be great and ecumenical when it received neither recognition nor assent from the primates of the other churches, but they consigned it to anathema? It did not enjoy the cooperation of the then Pope of Rome or his priests, neither by means of his representatives or an encyclical letter, as is the rule for councils, nor did it win the assent of the patriarchs of the East, of Alexandria, Antioch, and the Holy City, or of their priests and bishops." End quote. According to Nicaea II, it's a rule that a council must receive the cooperation of the Pope or his representatives to be considered ecumenical. Therefore, before Constantinople II received Vigilius's cooperation and approval, its decrees were not ecumenical. That means that the decrees of an ecumenical council did not condemn Pope Vigilius, contrary to what so many say. Yes, people present at what would become an ecumenical council condemned him, for reasons we will explain, but an ecumenical council did not. The Acts of Constantinople II were purged of the condemnations of Vigilius before he approved them. It should also be noted that various supporters of Eastern Orthodoxy misrepresent the teaching of Nicaea II in the aforementioned passage. Some of them claim that this passage means that the assent of all the patriarchs is a positive requirement for a council to be considered ecumenical. For example,
in the 6th session of the Council of Nicaea II, it explicitly says that you not only need all the patriarchs to accept the council, you would also need their synods to accept the council, for it to be truly ecumenical.
But that's not what the passage says. The passage does not say that the assent of all the patriarchs is a positive requirement or rule for a council to be considered ecumenical. Rather, it only specifies that cooperation of the Pope or his representatives is the rule. It does indicate that a council cannot be ecumenical if it's rejected by all the patriarchs and all the primates of the other churches. But that is not to teach that X number of patriarchs must approve it for it to be ecumenical. Allow me to make this distinction more clear with an example. One can truly say that a person who loses every single state in the presidential election cannot become president. But does that mean that a person must win every state, or even half the states, to become president? No, it doesn't. A man can become president by winning only 12 states and gaining the necessary 270 electoral votes. Therefore, to say that a man who loses every state is obviously not the president is not to specify that he must win even half of the states to become president. Analogously, in this passage, Nicaea II indicates that a council that's rejected by all the patriarchs, including the Pope, cannot be ecumenical. We agree. but that is not to specify that X number of patriarchs must approve it for it to be ecumenical. The only rule specified for positive assent in this passage is that the Pope of Rome or his representatives must cooperate with the Council, which confirms the Catholic position. The same misinterpretation and misrepresentation of this passage of Nicaea II is promoted by the following Eastern Orthodox heretic, liar, and fraud.
What makes a council ecumenical? That it is the ratification of all the patriarchs with an overwhelming majority of the bishops. This precept of patriarchal ratification is most apparent in the Seventh Ecumenical Council.
As we've shown, he's completely wrong. Now, although the decrees of an ecumenical council did not condemn Pope Vigilius, why would those at Constantinople too condemn the Pope rather than submit to his view? The answer is twofold. One, those who refused to submit to Emperor Justinian's position on this matter were simply removed. For example, Zolius, the Patriarch of Alexandria, didn't go along with Justinian at one point, so he was removed and replaced by Apollinaris, who did. That's a way to ensure that everyone at the council goes along with Justinian. Church historian Karl von Hefele gives other examples of the pressure applied to the bishops at an early stage of the controversy. Quote, "In the same way, Ephraim, Patriarch of Antioch, would not agree to the emperor's edict condemning the 3 chapters, but when he was threatened with deposition, he also subscribed. Patriarch Peter of Jerusalem, when at the beginning a company of monks visited him, he declared with an oath that whoever agreed with the new decree attacked the Council of Chalcedon. In spite of this, he agreed himself later on. Similar compulsion was brought to bear upon the other bishops, and it was resolved to extort the subscriptions of the whole episcopate." End quote. We also covered how Pope Vigilius was assaulted at the altar. He was under house arrest. Justinian's willingness to use force and remove his opponents loomed over the council. This resulted in a power struggle between Emperor Justinian and Pope Vigilius, with those at the council going along with the emperor. Second, as mentioned already, the Galatians 1:8 principle was widely recognized at this time. In fact, Galatians 1:8 is cited in Justinian's letter, which was read during Session 1 of the Council. And in Session 3, the Council states that a person separates himself from the Church by holding opinions contrary to the faith of the first 4 ecumenical councils. Since Pope Vigilius did flip-flop on certain matters connected with the 3 chapters, for reasons explained in this video, people at the council believed that Pope Vigilius had lapsed into heresy and ceased to be a member of the Church. The view that a claimant to the papal office has lost his membership and office in the Church is not incompatible with belief in the papacy. Indeed, when the people at the council condemned Vigilius, they added that they did not break communion with the See of Rome. That demonstrates that they believed he had ceased to be an occupant of the See of Peter as a result of heresy. The truth is that they wrongly applied the Galatians 1:8 principle to Vigilius. Vigilius was not a heretic. Yes, this was an unfortunate episode in church and papal history, but it does not refute Catholic teaching on papal supremacy. As we've shown, papal supremacy is demonstrated by various facts during this period, and by the official teaching of the ecumenical councils. In fact, in Session 5 of the Council, which took place on May 17, 553, the Council states this about Pope Vigilius, quote, "We shall communicate everything also to the most holy and most blessed in all respects, Pope of Elder Rome," end quote. In the same session, they further address Pope Vigilius, stating, quote, "It was indeed right, since you have obtained the prime dignity of the priesthood, most holy man, that matters that relate to the state of the holy churches be made known to your divinely honored beatitude," end quote. They make these statements about Pope Vigilius well after Vigilius had already repeatedly asserted his authority over Eastern bishops, such as by previously excommunicating Minas, etc., which resulted in apologies from Minas. So why would they profess communion with Vigilius and make these statements about him in Session 5 of the Council, well after he manifested his belief that he had authority over Eastern bishops? It's because they didn't consider papal supremacy itself to be contrary to the apostolic faith. But when they thought that Pope Vigilius had compromised on the Christological truths by not condemning the 3 chapters, they then wrongly concluded that he had ceased to be part of the Church for heresy against the Christological truths, and they broke communion with him in Session 7. This further indicates that what they considered to be incompatible with the faith was not the papacy itself, but rather heresies against the person of Christ. Now, before we address the objections to papal infallibility that are brought up with regard to Pope Vigilius's published documents, it must be noted that the Acts of Constantinople II, which initially contained statements that condemned Vigilius, were edited after Pope Vigilius gave his final condemnation of the 3 chapters. They were purged to remove all the condemnations of the Pope. Richard Price acknowledges this in his book on the Acts of Constantinople of 553. For example, Price writes, quote, "And indeed, when at the very end of the year Vigilius finally assented to condemn the 3 chapters, a new edition of the Conciliar Acts was produced, from which this decree and other embarrassing documents contained in the record of Session 7 were expunged, end quote. In his book called The Papacy, Eric Ibarra makes a good point by showing that Eastern Orthodox priest and scholar Father Asterios Garasterjas also acknowledged that the final version of the Acts were edited to remove the actions against Pope Vigilius. In his book called Justinian the Great, Father Asterios Garasterjas writes, quote, "Thus, by order of Justinian, passages were deleted from the Acts of Constantinople II, particularly those passages that were critical of Vigilius personally. The new form of the Acts, with the deletion and addition of words and sentences, gave the impression that Vigilius, with the approval of the Emperor and the Synod, did not participate in the Synod, and that after the work of the Synod was completed, he issued the second constitutum confirming its decisions as though it had been planned that way. Vigilius took these elaborated acts with him," end quote. That means that the version of the Acts that Pope Vigilius accepted and took with him did not contain the condemnations of Pope Vigilius. Those were the final version of the Acts by order of Emperor Justinian. Note how this important fact refutes another false argument made by this Eastern Orthodox fraud. He claims that Pope Pelagius, Vigilius' successor, approved the Acts of Constantinople II that condemned Vigilius, but he fails to realize, as just noted, that the final version of the Acts approved by Rome and Justinian removed the condemnations of Pope Vigilius.
Vigilius' successor, Pope Pelagius, signed off on the Acts of Constantinople II, the very same acts that decreed Pope Vigilius suspended from office until he accepted the council's decisions to be reinstated.
Another objection that the Eastern Orthodox make is that in Session 8 the council supposedly dogmatized a consensus-based model of church government, which, they say, contradicts the papal supremacy model.
The council responds, they say there's no other way to resolve conflict, resolve questions of faith and morals, than in a council. And it specifically says in their letter back to Pope Vigilius that even the apostles, even though all the apostles were infallible, it says, they had to meet in a council in Acts 15. It references Acts 15.
The Fifth Council says that the truth cannot be made manifest except in a collegial context, specifically in response to the invocation of papal authority. An ecumenical council of the Church recognizes such a way. Rome says that two are better than one. Each one needs the help of his neighbor, that the Pope cannot do what he just did because the apostles did not set that pattern. They waited until they were gathered together in a council, nor is there any other way in which the truth can be made manifest. I'm being repetitive because this is an essential point, and I don't think that there's a way to escape this.
Now, the preceding consensus-based approach to ecclesiology was explicitly dogmatized in the council sentence. Now it continues, since it is certain that it is through joint examination, when there is expounded what needs to be discussed on both sides, that the light of truth dispels the darkness of lies. For neither is it permissible in the case of faith for anyone to anticipate the judgment of the church in her totality. Right? So no person without joint examination could make a judgment for the church. This is in the decree of the Fifth Ecumenical Council.
The passage they cite from Session 8 is, quote, "For neither is it permissible in the case of the faith for anyone to anticipate the judgment of the church in her totality, since each person needs the help of his neighbor," end quote. But this argument fails for two reasons. Before we cover them, note that the addition of the Acts that was believed by many to reflect the version of the Acts accepted by Rome has a different reading for this passage. This edition of the Acts is called the Surius edition. That the Surius edition or version has a different reading for this passage is noted by Richard Price in his book on the Acts, Volume 2, page 102. The authenticity of the Surius version is also supported by an incomplete 9th century manuscript. The context of this passage concerns when things are proposed in public disputations which need to be explored on either side. Here's the Latin text of the Surius version. It translates to, quote, "For in public disputes over the faith, the truth can be manifested in no other way, since each of us needs the help of his fellow man," end quote. This version does not say that one man, such as the Pope, can never definitively settle disputes for the whole church. Rather, with regard to public disputes held at councils in which arguments are made on both sides, it says that a joint treatment of issues is needed to manifest the truth. However, the following 2 points are more important. First, no matter which version of the Acts you cite for this particular passage, the passage is not part of the Council's definition of faith. This passage is found in Session 8, number 4, paragraph 5 in Price's version. but the first 26 paragraphs of Session 8, Number 4 contain a history of their investigations. Paragraphs 3 through 6 in particular explain what happened and what they said when they tried to get Pope Vigilius to participate in the council. This summary of their investigations comes before the actual solemn decree and profession of faith, which begins in paragraph 27. Not everything stated at a council or in the Acts constitutes part of the council's definition or official teaching. This fact is supported by various statements in Constantinople II itself. For instance, in Session 6 of Constantinople II, the council summarizes what happened at the Council of Chalcedon with regard to the letter attributed to Ebos. It says that the council repudiated what the letter defended, and then it states, quote, "And in doing this they treated as of no account what had been said about the same letter by one or two," end quote. Notice, the council is saying that despite what one or two people apparently did or said at the Council of Chalcedon in regard to the letter attributed to Ebos, that is of no account. What matters is what the council formally decided or defined. Thus, not everything stated in the context of a council or in its acts necessarily represents the Church's official position or teaching. And this brings us to the next point, which is also very significant. It's that when they related what happened in their attempt to get Vigilius to participate in the council, which is found in paragraphs 3 through 6, they acknowledged that even after they cited examples about the importance or necessity of councils and joint investigations, such as Acts 15, Vigilius did not submit to their conclusions in this regard. This is from paragraph 6 of number 4 of Session 8 of the Acts. Quote, "When, however, even after mention of examples of this kind, he, Vigilius, postponed meeting together with us," end quote. Consider that carefully. Pope Vigilius did not agree to their conclusions concerning the necessity of a joint examination to settle disputes. The Acts prove that he did not agree with their conclusion in this regard. The Sirius version of this passage makes this point even more emphatically. It states, quote, "He, Vigilius, promised by himself to pass sentence concerning the same 3 chapters," end quote. Thus, Vigilius believed that he could himself pass sentence on the matter and that he did not need the council to do it. This proves that the council did not unanimously or formally teach that councils are required to settle disputes about the faith, for only what was approved by Vigilius bears the status of a binding teaching of an ecumenical council, as we've already proven from Nicaea II. The statements they made about the usefulness or importance of councils, however you want to frame them, which are contained in paragraphs 4 and 5, were simply what they said to Pope Vigilius, which they repeated when giving the history of their investigations. But Vigilius did not agree with their conclusions on this matter, as paragraph 6 shows, and their statements on this matter were not part of the council's formal decree condemning the 3 chapters, which begins in paragraph 27. If the council had formally professed and declared that no one person can solve a dispute about the faith, it must be done by a council, and Pope Vigilius had agreed with that, then the Eastern Orthodox would have an argument on this point. But they don't, because that's not what happened. Rather, Vigilius himself objected to their conclusions, as proven by paragraph 6, and their statements about councils were not part of the council's solemn decree. It's also ironic that Eastern Orthodox make this false argument while they consider Emperor Justinian to be a saint, when Justinian himself tried to settle the entire dispute prior to the council with his personal edicts and documents anathematizing the 3 chapters.
Saint Justinian the Emperor.
So, we have thoroughly addressed and refuted the objections to papal supremacy that are made from the case of Pope Vigilius and Constantinople II. Even though this is not a chapter of church history in which papal supremacy shone most brightly, this incident does not refute papal supremacy. Let's now consider the objections to papal infallibility that surround this period. The main accusations concern the different positions on the 3 chapters taken by Pope Vigilius in his first constitutum, dated May 14, 553, and his second constitutum, dated February 23, 554. As mentioned already, Pope Vigilius issued his Judicatum in 548, years before the council, which condemned the 3 chapters but added the caveat that he was not in any way detracting from the authority of Chalcedon. There's no problem there. On May 14, 553, while refusing to attend the council, which had recently concluded its 4th session, Vigilius issued his first constitutum. This rather long document led the council to condemn Vigilius during session 7. Here are the kinds of claims that Eastern Orthodox individuals and some Protestants make about Pope Vigilius and his first constitutum.
It seems like the first constitutum fits what would be commonly accepted criteria for what constitutes infallible teaching. It sure looks like he intends to teach by virtue of his authority on a question of faith and morals to the whole church. Here's the problem. The exact same thing is true of the second Constitutum. It's equally final and decisive, which he wrote 6 months later and takes the opposite view.
And Pope Vigilius did not condemn these 3 chapters of the books.
Instead, he wrote what's called the Constitutum, his first Constitutum, just means constitution. He wrote his first version of it. And in this version of it, he accepts that the authors of the 3 chapters were Orthodox. So he's subtly condemned in the Judicatum. Then he retracts it. Then he comes forward and he says, actually, not only was I wrong by that Judicatum, but these authors are actually Orthodox.
Vigilius defied the Fifth Ecumenical Council by refusing to condemn the Nestorian 3 chapters. He then went on to teach that the heretical documents were orthodox.
Additionally, he defended the heretical 3 chapters. These are all relevant when we talk about the history of the papacy.
Pope Vigilius was an advocate of the orthodoxy, Christologically speaking, of a document called the 3 chapters. Justinian and the Eastern bishops were not advocates of the orthodoxy of that document. Vigilius invoked his Petrine authority in order to justify his acceptance of the orthodoxy of the 3 chapters.
But those characterizations are simply false. Vigilius's first Constitutum explicitly condemns dozens of heretical writings attributed to Theodore of Mopsuestia. However, it does not condemn Theodore personally because he was dead, the previous councils did not, and Vigilius was not sure if Theodore wrote the heretical chapters. Further, during Session 5 of Constantinople II, a letter from St. Cyril of Alexandria is cited, in which St. Cyril notes that during the Council of Ephesus, a creed produced by Theodore was censured, but Theodore was not personally anathematized, because at the time, that was deemed best for the conversion of his followers. This statement of St. Cyril, and what occurred at Ephesus, factored into Vigilius's decision to not anathematize Theodore personally in this document. However, Vigilius's condemnations in the First Constitutum of Theodore's blasphemous statements constitute a crystal-clear profession of the true faith. That's evident to one who reads them carefully and fairly. Vigilius condemns the heresies in Theodore's writings with great precision, clarity, and force. Vigilius professes the true faith about the one person of Jesus Christ in 2 natures, while denouncing Theodore's Nestorian blasphemies. Before we show that there was actually no error at all in Pope Vigilius's solemn decree concerning Theodore in the First Constitutum, note that his decision to not condemn the person of Theodore in the First Constitutum, even though he strongly condemned 60 passages attributed to Theodore, whether you want to characterize that simply as an omission or an error, was not part of his solemn decree. Vigilius's explanation and his arguments for not condemning the person of Theodore are found in surrounding argumentation and commentary of the document, which are not necessarily protected by papal infallibility. That's the key point concerning papal infallibility. Whatever you want to say about Vigilius's surrounding argumentation on whether the person of Theodore should be condemned, and most of it amounts to Vigilius simply citing previous councils and other individuals, there's no error in what he solemnly decreed on the matter. Here's what Pope Vigilius solemnly decreed concerning Theodore and his heretical writings in the First Constitutum after he had condemned many blasphemous passages attributed to Theodore. Quote, "Therefore, while appropriately condemning these chapters of Theodore by the authority of an apostolic sentence, according to the correctness of the Orthodox faith, we resolve that all these things which, adhering to the decrees and traditions of the Fathers, we have condemned by apostolic authority should provide no occasion for defaming previous fathers and doctors of the Church, something that beyond doubt causes scandal in the sacrosanct Church. We anathematize everyone in ecclesiastical orders who, on the grounds of the above-mentioned impieties, decides to impose or inflict contumely in any way on the fathers and doctors of the Church." End quote. There's no error at all in this solemn decree. Some might object by pointing to a statement of Vigilius approximately 20 paragraphs later, in which he states, quote, "We do not presume to condemn him, that is Theodore, by our sentence, and nor do we allow him to be condemned by anyone else." End quote. But again, that's not part of his solemn decree, and what he says here is factually true. It's true that his solemn sentence, which we just quoted, did not condemn Theodore, nor did it justify Theodore. Further, his solemn sentence did not allow Theodore to be condemned, nor did it forbid Theodore from being condemned. The solemn sentence or decree itself did not legislate anything about Theodore personally. But even if Pope Vigilius had solemnly forbidden everyone from condemning the person of Theodore, which he did not, would that be a problem for papal infallibility? The answer is no, because it could be a disciplinary measure that forbids the condemnation until more information is ascertained about the person or the matter. The only thing that would be a problem is if Vigilius had solemnly declared that the person who wrote the heretical chapters attributed to Theodore was orthodox, but he did not do so. Hence, the solemn decree of the First Constitutum, with regard to the matter of Theodore and his heretical writings, does not contradict papal infallibility or the infallibility of the Church's laws. It contains no error at all. Let's now consider the First Constitutum's decree on certain writings of Theodoret of Cyrus, which is the second of the 3 chapters. As mentioned already, Theodoret's writings contained certain elements of Nestorianism, but Theodoret was restored to his see at the Council of Chalcedon after he agreed with the council and anathematized Nestorius. Thus, when Constantinople II condemned the 3 chapters, it did not condemn Theodoret after his reconciliation at Chalcedon, but it condemned various writings connected to him. Likewise, the council did not condemn Ebos personally after his reconciliation at Chalcedon, but it condemned the letter that was frequently attributed to him. With that in mind, consider the inaccuracy of the argument put forward by the following Eastern Orthodox heretics.
The contents of the Constitutum were orthodox in both cases, which I think I demonstrate was not true, because in one case he affirms the orthodoxy of the 3 writers, and in the other case he doesn't.
They condemn Pope Vigilius because in one case he supposedly affirmed that the authors of the 3 chapters are orthodox, while changing his view about the authors in another. But that's not what Vigilius did. Indeed, Constantinople II, the council they claim to accept, did not anathematize the persons of Theodoret and Ebos after their approval at Chalcedon. It condemned writings that were attributed to them, but it did not condemn them personally the way it condemned the person of Theodore.
In one case, he affirms the orthodoxy of the 3 writers, and in the other case, he doesn't.
So this is just another example of how Eastern Orthodox heretics mislead people with half-truths and false claims that often contradict their own positions. Now, in the First Constitutum, here's what Pope Vigilius actually decreed concerning Theodoret. Quote, "We decree and ordain that nothing is to be done or proposed by anyone in vilification or disparagement of a man fully approved at the Synod of Chalcedon, that is Theodoret, Bishop of Cyrus, under mention of his name, but maintaining reverence for his person in all respects, we anathematize and condemn whatever writings or doctrines published under anyone's name that clearly accord with the heresies of those criminals Nestorius and Eutyches." End quote. Similar to his decree concerning the writings of Theodore, there's no error at all in the actual solemn decree concerning Theodoret. One could take issue with some of Vigilius's other statements or arguments concerning Theodoret in his First Constitutum, but the actual decree is that Theodoret is not to be personally condemned, since he was reconciled at Chalcedon, and Vigilius condemns whatever writings or doctrines published under anyone's name, including Theodoret's, which agree with the heresies of Nestorius and Eutyches. So there's no error in that, and no problem for papal infallibility. Let's now consider what Vigilius says in the First Constitutum about the 3rd chapter, the letter to Mari the Persian, which was often attributed to Ebos. This is a tad more involved, but again, as we will see, there's no error against faith or morals in the solemn decree. The letter to Mari the Persian, which was often attributed to Ebos, was read during Session 10 of the Council of Chalcedon. Shortly after it was read, Ebos was declared worthy of his see. During that session, the papal legates also said, quote, "Ebos has been proved innocent, and from the reading of his letter we have found him to be orthodox." End quote. That series of events, namely the reading of the letter to Mari the Persian, the statement by the papal legates that Ebos is innocent, and the restoration of Ebos to his see, led many to conclude that Chalcedon in some manner had approved the letter to Mari the Persian when it approved Ebos. The truth is that the council did not issue any formal decree approving the contents of the letter to Mari, but many believed that it had done so. There was also a letter from the clergy of Edessa read during Session 10, and to this day some dispute which letter was referred to by the papal legates when they pronounced Ebos innocent. When Pope Vigilius wrote his First Constitutum, he believed, like many others, that the authority of Chalcedon had in some manner approved the letter to Mari as at least not heretical, when it judged Ebos worthy of being restored to his see. Thus Vigilius tried to show that the letter was not manifestly heretical, but he did not try to defend everything stated in the letter. For instance, Vigilius stated, quote, "Those statements, however, in the priest Ebos's letter that censured Cyril of blessed memory through a mistaken interpretation, the fathers at the Holy Synod of Chalcedon, when they pronounced the letter orthodox, in no way accepted." End quote. Vigilius argued that the statements against St. Cyril in the letter to Mari were the result of a mistake in interpretation. Vigilius was incorrect about what Chalcedon did with regard to the letter to Mari the Persian. That mistake and his desire to harmonize what happened at Chalcedon with opposition to Nestorianism does not make him a heretic. It just makes him wrong about a matter of fact and in some of his arguments. So in the First Constitutum, there are errors made by Vigilius on the matter of the letter to Mari, which were corrected in his second constitutum. But again, here's the key point. There isn't any error against the faith in what he actually solemnly decreed in the first constitutum concerning the letter to Mari. After making various arguments, here's what Pope Vigilius formally decreed concerning the matter of the letter to Mari, which was often attributed to Ebos. Quote, "We decree and ordain with the authority of our present verdict that, as regards all matters, and in particular the off-cited letter of the Venerable Ebos, the judgment of the Fathers in session at Chalcedon is to remain inviolate. By this our constitution, we do not permit anyone with ecclesiastical rank or dignity ever to presume, whether by addition or abridgment or amendment or in any way, to make any rash innovation in the matter of the same letter, or in other matters that at the Council of Chalcedon, with the assent of the representatives of the Apostolic See, were resolved, ordained, defined, and decreed as if they were imperfect and open to criticism." End quote. His decree is that the judgment of the Fathers at Chalcedon with regard to the letter of Ebos is to remain inviolate. There's no error against faith or morals in that decree. The actual judgment of the Council of Chalcedon could not be erroneous. Further, the position taken at Session 6 and Session 8 of Constantinople II was that Chalcedon disapproved the letter attributed to Ebos, despite what one or two fathers said at Chalcedon. So when Vigilius decrees that in this matter the judgment of the Fathers at Chalcedon is to remain inviolate, that's perfectly consistent in faith with the position Constantinople II would take on the matter. Herein we see God's providence. Even though Pope Vigilius took an incorrect position on the letter attributed to Ebos in parts of his first constitutum, when it came to his actual solemn decree about the letter attributed to Ebos, he was preserved from teaching any error against the faith. What he actually solemnly decreed about the letter, namely that the judgment of Chalcedon is to remain inviolate, is perfectly consistent in faith with what Constantinople II would say about the letter. God protected the official decree of the Pope. Thus, there's no error against faith or morals in Vigilius's solemn decree, and certainly no refutation of papal infallibility. So with this examination of the first constitutum, we've shown that despite some errors in the surrounding argumentation of the document, there's no contradiction of papal infallibility, because no error against the faith was solemnly decreed by Vigilius. In his second constitutum and in his second letter to Eutychius, Vigilius did condemn Theodore personally, and explicitly condemned the letter said to be from Ebos, as well as various things that Theodoret wrote impiously. That's the same position taken by Constantinople too. Vigilius also rescinded anything to the contrary that may have been done previously. So yes, his second constitutum and his second letter to Eutychius reflect a position that is different on some aspects of the 3 chapters controversy from what is contained in his first constitutum, namely on whether Theodore personally should be condemned and whether the letter attributed to Ebos was heretical. But those later documents do not contradict what he solemnly legislated in the first constitutum in any matter of faith, because, as we've shown, besides the many powerful condemnations of the heretical writings attributed to Theodore, what he solemnly legislated in the first constitutum was very limited, and it contains no error against faith or morals at all. The fact that there are a few errors in Vigilius's surrounding argumentation and commentary of the first constitutum does not change the fact that the solemn decree itself contains no error against faith or morals or sound discipline. Having examined these facts in detail, consider the following claim of Eastern Orthodox priest Father Alexius Garastorgios. He states, quote, "The letter to Eutychios and the second constitutum have great importance, in that through them the Pope abolishes formally a dogmatic decision which he had made formally." End quote. That's not true at all. In fact, it's nonsense, as we've demonstrated. So when the Eastern Orthodox emphasized that Vigilius closed his first constitutum with this solemn language,
and then at the end of that first constitutum, he says this: "We ordain and decree that it be permitted to no one to write or bring forth anything contradictory to the contents of this constitutum, or after this declaration begin a new controversy about them. And if anything has already been done in contradiction of this our ordinance, this we declare void by the authority of the Apostolic See." So he gives the council his constitutum, and he says, this is the papal decree. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. He literally says it's by the authority of the Apostolic See.
That doesn't prove their point, because as we've shown, there's nothing against the faith in the solemn decree of the first constitutum, and there were disciplinary elements that could be revoked by the Pope at any time. It should also not be surprising that people on all sides found it difficult to navigate this controversy. It was a complicated issue, and there was a fine line between condemning past expressions of heresies allegedly from individuals who were reconciled at Chalcedon, while not giving the impression that one was undermining the authority of Chalcedon. Intense pressure was also applied to Vigilius, as we've shown. Some also make the claim that Pope Vigilius submitted to the council, demonstrating that it had superior authority.
The schism ended when the Pope submitted to the decision of the council.
This again is false. As Richard Price correctly notes, quote, he, Vigilius, confirmed the decrees of the council, but he did not confirm its authority. Indeed, he made no mention of it at all. Instead, he took over its decrees and issued them in his own name. Again, it is his voice that is presented as definitive, end quote. Some also make the claim that in his second letter to Eutychius, Vigilius acknowledges that the devil deceived him in this matter. Yes, Vigilius was wrong about some aspects of the controversy, but that doesn't mean that he considered himself to have been a heretic. He did not. In the same document, he professes that he upholds the four councils, and he says that we were and are in agreement concerning the one faith, indicating that he has held the one true faith during the whole period. By the way, Pope Vigilius' second letter to Eutychius, which was one of the documents in which Vigilius issued his own condemnation of the 3 chapters, was described as part of the council's 8th session in documents from the council. Thus, the acts of the council ultimately included the Pope's personal decree on the matter, in which he anathematizes anyone who contradicts his solemn decree. In that document, which was included in the Acts of the Council, Vigilius also says, quote, may the whole of the universal church recognize that we have proceeded to the contents of this our decree justly and in a way that is not open to criticism, end quote. The inclusion of this document in the Acts further indicates that Vigilius's personal exercise of universal authority was not incompatible with the final decrees of the Council. So, in this video, we've carefully examined the, quote, strongest argument against the papacy, made by the Eastern, quote, Orthodox and some Protestants who look more carefully into the early church. We've shown that the argument completely fails. The papacy is certainly true, having been established by Jesus Christ in St. Peter. It's proven by Scripture, the Church Fathers, and the ecumenical councils that even the Eastern, quote, Orthodox claim to accept. See, for example, our video on Nicaea II. To be a true Christian and be saved, one must be a traditional Catholic, as our material explains.